So we're going to be doing the first half of Unit 2 today because Unit 2 was huge. So last semester, I divided the unit into two sections and I almost put it as one section this semester, but there was like 45 slides and I figured that was not something I would ever be able to do in one day. And in fact, this fits into one class period pretty perfectly, so I'm glad I did. Also, in terms of AP review questions, this unit has double the amount of the other units. So this unit is asked about more often than the others as well. It's also just a very technical unit. There's a lot of specific definitions, specific where it is in the Constitution, specific how does Congress, how does the presidency, the judicial branch, and the bureaucracy work. So we have to go into a lot of just infrastructure concepts in this unit, which can be a little tedious, but are often asked about. So I need to break it down. So we're going to start with Congress and do Congress and the presidency today, and then do the judicial and bureaucracy tomorrow. So Congress, remember, is set up by Article 1 of the Constitution. It lays out the roles, responsibilities, and enumerated powers of Congress, which it is supposed to be set up, as we talked about the writing of the Constitution in a bicameral legislature, which is the House and the Senate. And I'm going to go into each of those specifically in the lecture today. But remember, Congress is the umbrella term. But when you are writing on your short answer questions answers about Congress, and it is an answer that is specifically for the Senate or specifically for the House, you can't just say Congress. You need to specify which one you're talking about. So if you're talking about ratification of treaties, you would need to say the Senate approves, ratifies treaties with 2/3 of the Senate. So you need to specifically mention the branch if it is a role of just one of the two branches. Now, things like making a bill, that can start in either branch and go through both. So that one is under both branches of Congress. But if it's a specific responsibility of one branch, you need to say it in terms of that one branch. Now, let's break into the House of Representatives first. This is, from the get-go, supposed to be the one most representative of the people. In fact, that's why it's called the People's House. Originally, it was the only federal government branch that the people could directly elect their representatives, because the president is through the Electoral College. The Senate was originally chosen by state legislators, so this was the most direct connection with the people to the federal government when we wrote our Constitution. Also, it's set up to be tied more closely to the people because there's more representatives tied more closely to the individual districts within each state, which there are 435 districts spread across the country, and each representative from those districts are supposed to cater to the needs of their specific constituents. So they are much more closely tied to their constituents than senators, where there's only 2 in each state, and the president, where they're representing the entire country. Also, to be more closely tied to the people, there is a 2-year election term for House of Representative members versus the Senate, which is 6 years, and the presidency, which is 4. So they have to be more closely in touch with what their constituents want because they face re-election more often than the other branches. Although they do also have the largest incumbency advantage of the other branches as well, but still, written out, they are the most tied to the people. Now, when we talk about districts in the House of Representatives, we need to tie that to gerrymandering because their districts are determined every 10 years by the US Census, which looks at population distribution. But what we've seen throughout the drawing of these district lines is sometimes those lines are drawn unfairly to benefit one group over the other. So remember, we have partisan gerrymandering, which is redrawing districts to benefit one political party over another. We have racial gerrymandering, which benefits districts by one race over the other. And we're going to look at Supreme Court cases today of how the Supreme Court has ruled in terms of what is acceptable drawing of districts and what is not. So that's how we'll end the lecture. But gerrymandering goes hand in hand with the drawing of districts in the House of Representatives. In the Senate, This is supposed to be a more civil, a more mature group that is able to stay in their position for longer, so they're not as closely tied to their constituents as the House of Representatives. They're elected every 6 years. They have to be older. So they're supposed, and there's only 50 of them. So they're supposed to be much smaller and more organized and less chaotic than the tyranny of the masses of the House of Representatives. So when we look at things like discussing bills on the floor of the House and the Senate, the House is going to have more stringent rules to keep order that the Senate does not, because it wasn't seen that the Senate would need more stringent rules on negotiating bills on the floor. Originally, as well, I already mentioned this, but again, to bring in the 17th Amendment, because it's asked about semi-often, senators were decided by state legislators, but in the 17th Amendment in 1913, that changed to direct election of senators, tying them more to the people, but still less than the House of Representatives. So first, let's talk about the explicitly mentioned powers of Congress in the Constitution, which Congress is Article 1 of the Constitution, and the explicitly constitutionally mentioned powers are called the enumerated powers. So the enumerated powers of Congress are the powers given to Congress, tying them again to the people, knowing that this is the branch most tied to the people. They give the power of the federal budget to Congress. So when we talk about things like taxes and we talk about things of how much the government's going to spend, the most directly representative group is the one passing taxes and how much we're spending, which remember is the power of the purse. That also is an important check on the bureaucracy and the executive branch when we get to that as well, because they are the ones who decide funding for the executive branch. They also have the power to coin money, declare war, which this is a tricky one because in US history, if we wanted to fight another country, we would have Congress officially declare war, but we actually haven't declared war since World War II. Congress has not declared war. So when you think about all the other foreign entanglements we've been involved in, Korea, Vietnam, the Iraq wars, Afghanistan, none of those were actually officially declared war, which why this is significant is it shows a transition from the power of US foreign intervention from a congressional power to more of an executive power. Because what we've seen now is the president, who I'll talk about in a moment, is the commander-in-chief of the armed forces, has been more responsible for sending troops to other countries, even though technically declaring wars in the power of Congress. So we're seeing a transition of fighting moving more to the executive branch than to the legislative branch. But it is an enumerated power of Congress. And they're the ones who set up and fund the armed forces. So they set up the branches and decide funding to the armed forces. So even if the president is sending troops to other countries, we still have Congress's ability, if they, for example, did not want to send troops or they're just not wanting the president to do this, they could cut funding to those branches. Implied powers of Congress are set up by the necessary and proper clause, which I know we already talked about with McCulloch v. Maryland. This is in the Constitution, setting up the idea that not everything in the Constitution will cover all of the policy that Congress will need to pass for all of US history. There are going to be things that come up that aren't in the Constitution. So the founders wrote in the Constitution that if there is something that is deemed necessary and proper to run the country, Congress can pass it as a law, which the first big example and debated example of this, which we also talked about in McCulloch v. Maryland, was should we have a central bank? It's not in the Constitution, but if Congress is supposed to have power of the purse, how can they do that without a well-regulated financial system? So that's how Congress justified establishing a central bank, because it was deemed necessary and proper for them to successfully have the power to manage the federal budget and taxes. And we see this also as things pop up that didn't really exist in the original founders' ideas of problems in the country, like environmental issues. Like this is deemed necessary and proper in today's society that wasn't as much as an issue 200 years ago. So now let's look at leadership, which there's some similarities. Both the House and the Senate have a majority party in control and a minority party. The majority party in control is called the majority caucus. So the political party with the largest number of representatives in the House and the largest number of senators in the Senate. And the minority caucus is the party that does not have a majority in the House or the Senate. So pretty simple definition, but why that's significant, which has the majority caucus, is that determines the leadership of the House and the Senate. And the most powerful position in Congress is the Speaker of the House. This is a position in the House of Representatives. It does not exist in the Senate. But they have so much power in determining what happens on the House floor, who goes to what committees, what bills go to each committee, that it ends up being a very, very important position in the whole sector of Congress. And it is also the person who is second in line to the president, first in line, of course, being the vice president. And so I mentioned most of these, but they get to decide who fulfills positions on committees, like special committees, which I'll talk about in a minute, which bills go to which committees. And so even though they're supposed to be, committees are supposed to be bipartisan and bills are supposed to go to the committee that makes the most sense over the topic of the bill, the party that's in control of the House and the Speaker of the House can have a significant impact on what bills are heard where and by whom. So that's a large amount of power. Now, in the next below in the House is the Speaker of the House, the majority leader of the House. The majority leader of the House of Representatives, their job is to keep the party, which is the Republican Party right now, so I'll use them as an example, keep the Republican Party united and voting on a united front in terms of legislation. So making sure the Republican Party stays along Republican Party lines and stays united, which the majority whip is the enforcer of the majority leader's political alignment. So the majority whip makes sure and rules out punishments to those Republicans in the House that are not following along with Republican Party goals. Which enforcement sounds very dramatic, but by that I mean they can take people out of committees, take away responsibilities, kind of shun them from the party. Their enforcement is still in the realm of their power in the House of Representatives. It's not, more aggressive than that. And then the minority leader and the minority whip have the same exact job for the other party, but they're still significant because every 2 years when the House of Representatives voting happens, that balance can change because it's a very close balance shift. And so whoever is the minority leader and the minority whip might then become the next Speaker of the House and majority leader. So we see those positions of power changing every 2 years with each new congressional session, which that is a point too. There is a new congressional session every 2 years, and at each new congressional session, they pick a new Speaker of the House. So Mike Johnson currently will not serve from 2 years from when he started. He is finishing out Kevin McCarthy's term. So they will vote on a new Speaker of the House in the next legislative session, which they could pick the same Speaker of the House or they could pick someone different. In the Senate, technically the vice president is the president of the Senate, but that sounds like they have a lot of power and authority, but really they only have one job in the Senate, and it's to break a tie. If there's a tie in the vote of the 100 senators, the vice president is the tiebreaker. But they're not allowed to participate in debates. They're not allowed to be on committees. They're not allowed to bring bills to the floor. So the vice president's role, other than a tiebreaker, is really just ceremonial. And a lot of times the vice president just doesn't go to the Senate meetings, the Senate hearings, because they don't really have a role. So when the vice president isn't there, they have the president pro temp or pro tempore who takes that position, that ceremonial position. But the president pro temp also doesn't have any official, power beyond just that ceremonial head of the Senate. The Senate position that actually has the most power in terms of things they can do is the Senate Majority Leader. The Senate Majority Leader has a lot of the same responsibilities as the Speaker of the House. The Senate Majority Leader can assign bills to committees, can assign people to committees. They're the ones that help dictate the rules of the Senate. So it's similar to the Speaker of the House, just not as many responsibilities as the Speaker of the House. So then committees, which I've been mentioning a couple of times in the past few slides. When a bill is being turned into a law, one of the most important processes is it being sent to a committee who irons out problems with the bill, adds things to the bill, retracts things from the bill, listens to expert testimonies on the topic the bill is about, and decides if that bill should be approved to be voted on the floor of the House or the Senate. So both the House and the Senate have committees, and there are different types of committees based on what they are trying to accomplish. So the first type is a standing committee, which is a permanent committee. So these are committees over issues that are ongoing in our country and will continue to be ongoing. So like immigration and the economy and foreign affairs would be examples of standing committees. And so these are always there with members ready for any bill that comes through that is under this reoccurring topic. So it's a permanent committee. And then another permanent committee is a joint committee. But the purpose and what it is a little different. They're both permanent committees, but a joint committee, like it sounds, includes members from both the House and the Senate. But the joint committee is not for passing legislation. The joint committees are more for oversight in nature, overseeing like bureaucratic agencies, overseeing the government, overseeing the branches, overseeing the implementation of laws. So joint committees include members from both the Senate and the House, but are more oversight in nature than passing a bill. Which there is another type of both the House and the Senate coming together in a committee, and that's called a conference committee. This is a specific type of committee when a bill's becoming a law, when it's passed the House and it's passed the Senate, but there are differences in the bill that have to be ironed out. Because for a bill to make it past Congress, it has to be identically passed in the House and the Senate. There can't be any discrepancies in the version of the bill in the different branches. So a conference committee comes together to iron out differences in a bill before it gets sent back to the House and Senate for the final version to be passed. So both joint and conference committees include members from the House and the Senate, but they have very different purposes. The joint committee is for oversight. The conference committee is to iron out differences in a bill. The last type of committee is select committee. These are non-permanent committees. So I think select issues. So when a specific issue comes up that a bill is addressing, or an issue that's coming up based on what's happening in the United States right now, but is not permanent, they can form a select committee to deal with this specific issue. But once the specific issue has been resolved, the committee is dissolved as well. So it's not a permanent committee, it's temporary and resolves based on when the issue is over. All right, we have that. Schoolhouse Rock could do it, but I'm going to give you the more technical version, although that is an excellent review because they are very accurate in the process, but how a bill becomes a law, which is, you know, sounds simple and the song's really cute, but actually very technical. There's a lot of things you have to know about it. First thing is a bill can start in either branch. A bill can start in the House or the Senate. And either way, it'll go through the same process. So it'll go through the same process whether it starts in the House or the Senate. So the bill has to be introduced by a congressman, so a senator in the Senate, a representative in the House, and then that bill has to be assigned to a committee to decide how the bill is going to be finalized, drafted, and voted on. So it's assigned to a committee, but most bills actually die in committee. Most bills, the committee may not even ever take it up. And if they never take it up, it'll never be ironed out and it'll never go back to the floor to be voted on. So most bills die in committee. However, we do have what's called discharge petition, where if a bill is stuck in committee and they're not moving forward with it in the committee, the House can file a discharge petition, which will force that bill to come to the floor to be voted on instead of dying in committee. So discharge petition is a way to keep the bill from dying in committee. It brings it back to the floor and then it has to be voted on. Now, it gets sent to a committee. They figure out what's going to be in the bill, what's not going to be in the bill. And then once the majority of those in the committee vote on a final version of that bill, it gets sent to the floor. So let's say this is a bill that originates in the House, gets sent to a House committee. The majority of the committee members vote to move the bill forward. It gets sent to the House floor to be voted on. And the House, because there's 435 representatives, has a strict rule system for the debate on the House floor. Like, people who are debating have time limits for how long they can speak, how many people can speak. A lot of this is overseen by the House Rules Committee, but then the Speaker of the House is the mediator while the debates are going on. So the Speaker of the House enforces the House Rules Committee's rules while the bill is being debated on the House floor. Now, they can make it to where you can't edit the bill. You can't amend the bill once it's out of committee and on the House floor. That's called a closed rule. Or if it's an open rule, the House of Representatives members are allowed to edit, to amend the bill when it's on the House floor. And that's decided by the House Rules Committee. The House Rules Committee can also do a committee of the whole, which relaxes some of these stringent House rules where they only need a quorum or 100 congressmen, House of Representatives members there instead of all 435 to consider the bill, or some of the other rules of debate and what they can and can't add. They may relax those under the committee of the whole. I already mentioned discharge position. And then in the Senate, it goes through the same process. It gets sent to committee, majority when the committee votes, then it gets sent to the Senate floor to vote. But there's only 100 senators. So there aren't set up as many rules for senators in terms of debating the bill, which is why in the Senate, we have the issue of the filibuster, where senators who don't want a bill to be voted on will just keep talking and talking and talking as long as they possibly can to stall the vote or try and prevent the vote from happening, which can make Senate hearings and floor votes very, very, very long. So there are ways around a filibuster. Cloture, which I think of cloture like clotting a wound, like stopping the bleeding. This is a way that if 60 of the 100 senators vote to cloture, that means that they will end debate and force a vote. So it's pretty much stopping the talk and just voting. So if 60 of the 100 senators are over it and want to end debate and just want to vote on the issue, they can vote to do that. Unanimous consent requires all 100 senators, but that is if all 100 senators agree, they can restrict privileges like the filibuster to limit how much debate is happening before the bill's voted on. So those are two ways of limiting the filibuster in the Senate. But unanimous consent is really difficult to do because you need all 100 senators, whereas cloture, you only need 60 in order to stop debate and force a vote. Then, once, let's say the House, the majority of the House votes yes on the bill, then it gets sent to the Senate and goes through the whole Senate's process, which is the same. And then when both of them have passed a version of the bill, I already mentioned the conference committee comes together and irons out differences, finds a identical version of the bill that gets sent back to the House and the Senate to vote on. And if both the House and the Senate vote on that identical version of the bill, then it moves out of Congress into the president's desk, which the president has three options: sign the bill into law, and then it's a law; veto the bill, which is saying he is not giving his consent, and then the bill goes back to Congress. And for Congress to override the veto, it needs a 2/3 vote from both branches, the House and the Senate, to override the veto, which is difficult to do, but has been done before when there's a united Congress on wanting a bill to become a law. They have overridden vetoes before. Or if Congress passes a bill to the president within the last 10 days of that congressional session, the president could choose to sit on it, not sign it, not veto, and then it dies when the legislative session ends. So it's a way for the president to not make the bill a law, but not run the risk of vetoing it and have Congress override the veto. And then it essentially can't be brought up again until the next legislative session. And who knows who will have the majority in that one. In terms of oversight, the Congress has oversight over both branches. Over the president and bureaucracy, again, they have the power of the purse. They also have the power of approval of appointments. So when the president appoints people to the bureaucratic agencies, to his cabinet, when the president appoints the leaders of the Federal Reserve and federal justices, including Supreme Court justices, the Senate has to approve those appointments, which the Senate usually does approve presidential appointments, especially within his own cabinet and bureaucracy, because the Senate wants the president to work with people that he works well with. So this is something that doesn't usually have an issue of going through. It has before, like we know Supreme Court justices have been denied, and all the way back in the Oppenheimer era, we know that Congress has denied cabinet members, but it is very rare. They can do this though. Again, an important check. Also, approval of treaties. An official treaty with a foreign country that a president negotiates has to be approved by 2/3 of the Senate for it to be an accepted treaty, which is why the League of Nations never went through after World War I. Now, to end the congressional side, I have some very commonly talked about random definitions. Riders. Riders are add-ons to bills that have nothing to do with the bill itself. I mean, we just saw the bill for foreign aid pass Congress just like last week. And within that bill, there was a stipulation to ban TikTok if the Chinese company didn't sell TikTok to another owner. That doesn't directly tie to foreign aid to Ukraine or humanitarian aid to Gaza. It was an add-on to it. So sometimes riders can be added on in order to get the bill to pass. Like some politicians, some representatives be like, I will only vote on this if you add the things I need or I want for my constituents want. Or sometimes riders are added on to a bill that is guaranteed to pass. Because if there's a huge issue that Congress knows will go through, well, they can add on a lot of little stuff to it, so that gets accepted as well. So riders can be added on for different reasons, but anything attached to a bill that is not directly under the topic of the bill. Pork barrel legislation, I've seen asked about a bunch. This is that, I think, bringing home the bacon. So when House of Representatives members push through legislation tied specifically to their district. So, if a congressman from Florida passes through legislation that ties to the preservation of sea turtles in his specific district, that is pork barrel legislation. So it's very much tied to one congressman's district and legislation just specifically for them, helping out their constituents specifically instead of the nation as a whole. And then log rolling is kind of that mutual back scratching that happens in Congress when something's being voted on, being like, well, I'll vote in favor of your bill if when down the line my bill that I'm invested in comes up, you vote in favor of my bill. So log rolling is that, I'll help you, you help me situation going on with voting in Congress. This is a very easy, but very often, I put 2 asterisks, so it's asked about a lot on the AP exam, just know the difference. The 3 different types of representation that we see in the legislative branch. Delegate, which delegate-centered, delegate model is when the representative votes directly based on what the constituents want, no matter what. So my constituents want me to vote yes on this, I will vote yes on this. Like straight line, I will vote with my constituents. So delegate-centered, they're voting based on what the constituents want. Trustee model is where, as an elected representative, I'm going to vote on what I think is best. And my constituents voted me into office because they trust me. So even if they don't agree with what I'm voting on, they should, as the trustee, as the educated person who knows what's best for society, let me vote how I think is best. So they vote on their own opinion, whether or not it agrees with their constituents. And then Politico is a hybrid. So you vote with your constituents unless you really think it's not what's best for society. So it's a little bit of delegate and it's a little bit of trustee. Mostly delegate unless they really think they cannot align with their constituents on an issue. All right, so the presidency doesn't have as many specifics, but I still need to go over the powers of the president. Remember, the president lays out their policy agenda all the way back to when they're running for president, the promises the president makes for what they're going to do when they're in office. And so these are a lot of promises the president doesn't even have power to make. A lot of them are things that Congress has to pass through bills. However, because the president has the people's ear and that power of persuasion, and Congress knows they have to work with the president, they know that some of the things in their policy agenda they still can push through. And if Congress doesn't work with them, there's still the option of executive order, which I'm going to talk about in a minute. Now, the official role of the president is to execute the laws, which we know this is through the president and the presidential agencies known as the bureaucracy, which we're going to cover tomorrow. And the president is supposed to be the most difficult requirement-wise to be in this position, but you don't need to know like the specific age and, you know, resident for how long. It's just, it is the most stringent requirements for any political office in the country. So the constitutionally laid out powers of the president are called the express or formal powers. So enumerated powers, powers laid out in the Constitution for Congress. Express powers, powers laid out in the Constitution for the president, which is laid out in Article 2. Those are the president's powers laid out. We have the president as commander-in-chief, the leader of the armed forces, which, remember, George Washington took this quite literally, and during the Whiskey Rebellion, he rode in with the soldiers on horseback to show the power of the national government and him as the commander-in-chief. No other presidents have done that since, but technically, you know, they are the commander-in-chief. They do lead the armed forces. Although, as I mentioned before, Congress has the power to actually declare war. They also have the power to grant reprieves and pardons. Difference between the two. A reprieve is you're still guilty, but you were punished too severely. So lessening the punishment or ending the punishment. If you've served your time, you're done. So it's not saying you're innocent. It's just saying your punishment was too severe. A pardon is clearing of all wrongdoing. So a pardon is actually not just taking away punishment, but also guilt. So like when Ford took over after Nixon resigned, Ford immediately pardoned Nixon of all wrongdoing, which meant that Nixon could not be tried in the whole scandal with Watergate. And then in the Constitution, it gives power to the president to negotiate treaties, but again, that needs 2/3 Senate approval, appoint foreign ambassadors, and pretty much be the head of discussions with foreign countries. So, you know, meet with foreign countries, try and have peaceful relationships and trade. The president is the figurehead of those negotiations and treaties, although actual treaties are required approval of the Senate. And then we've talked about the appointments that the president makes. They appoint their cabinet, they appoint foreign ambassadors, they appoint Supreme Court justices and all federal judges, and they appoint their own office staff, which all of those need Senate approval except for their own personal office staff, because that's the, you know, working directly underneath the president, but not in like a large capacity like his cabinet. Implied powers, powers not in the Constitution, but have been regularly used by the president, party leader and crisis manager, which we'll talk about that with the Federalist document that goes over the executive branch in a moment. But these three implied powers have become common use of the presidency as it's gone on. Executive orders. So if the president knows they cannot get something passed by Congress that's in their policy agenda, one of their options is to issue an executive order, which gives something the force of a law without actually going through the process of becoming a law, which is a very large power of the president that's not in the Constitution. However, this power can be overturned by Congress and can be overturned by the next president. So it is something that gives the president power to issue something with the force of law, but it doesn't have the guarantee of a long-lasting order. Executive agreement is if a president wants to negotiate with other countries, but doesn't want to have to go through the 2/3 Senate approval of an actual treaty. An executive agreement is that agreement between countries that the president negotiates on behalf of the United States without the actual formal process of a treaty, which this also has, pretty much power only as long as that president is in office. The next president can roll this back. We saw this with the Paris climate conversations where, Obama was in, Trump removed, Biden put back in. So this can change by changing of presidents and also can be overturned by Congress. And finally, signing statements. These don't really do anything in terms of changing laws. It's just the president's feeling about the law as they sign it in. So as they're like, all right, I'm going to sign this bill into a law, it's either like, yes, look at how important this bill is, or I don't agree with this law, but I'm going to still sign it because of this, or this is how I think the law should be executed. So it's the president's opinion on the bill that he's signing into law. And then a term I've seen pop up a lot is the role of the president as the bully pulpit, which again is that kind of he is the most public figure in the country. And so he has this power of persuasion by being able to address the country specifically. And that can then in turn lead to constituents wanting the president's policy agenda passed and Congress having to address that issue as well. So this is the power of the president to reach out to the people and get policy motivated through the people and then have Congress take up the issue. And then another constitutional requirement of president is a State of the Union address. However, they don't have to give it in person. And it used to just be mostly a written address, but now in recent times, it's become a hugely publicized, huge pep rally event where the president lays out what he's done and what the plan is for the future. So we have 2 Supreme Court cases and 1 foundational doc. Both Supreme Court cases are gerrymandering. So gerrymandering ones, which are Baker versus Carr, which popped up, the first gerrymandering case, which popped up in the 1960s. This case brought up the issue of states not reapportioning their district as their population changes, which Tennessee had not changed their district lines in decades, even though their population has significantly changed, which ended up giving unfair power to rural areas and taking power away from urban areas, which had grown in those decades since. So those suing on this topic said that by not redrawing their districts, it was violating the 14th Amendment Equal Protection Clause, where people do not have equal representation in Congress because they are not redrawing based on population. The Supreme Court agreed that it is not fair because it is not proportional and that districts need to be drawn, key phrase, where one person, one vote applies. So population needs to equally be distributed. Districts need to be equally distributed by population. So the first ruling in terms of gerrymandering was in favor of redrawing districts based on population, because if not, it infringed on the 14th Amendment Equal Protection Clause. The second gerrymandering is post-civil rights era, when we are now implementing not just based on population, but with issues based on racial gerrymandering as well that could limit African-American vote. So to prevent this, and based on the Voting Rights Act of 1965, federal rule was requiring districts to represent the minorities in their state. And North Carolina became the figure for this Supreme Court case because they were required by the federal government to draw 2 predominantly African-American districts within their state. And they ended up having to draw very odd-shaped districts to meet that qualification. And the reason why is because North Carolina had 20% African-Americans, but they felt like that 20% was not being represented in Congress. And so the suing of this one was actually a white woman who said she was being discriminated against by creating these African-American districts because her voice was being diminished, because it was guaranteeing a predominantly African-American district that would vote along those lines. And she also argued that it violated her 14th Amendment equal protection rights. And the Supreme Court agreed with her that it was a kind of discrimination to base a district purely on race. And so they made it to where you could not have that be the only reason of drawing a district a certain way to make sure that one race was disproportionately advantaged over another, even to try and reverse the effects of, years of discrimination. It was unfair to do it to that extreme of a level. So redistricting cannot be drawn purely on race. And the last thing for today is Federal 70. This is the executive branch foundational docs that Alexander Hamilton wrote because there was a lot of complaints about having a president, one president. They were afraid that that would just be another monarchy. And we just broke away from Britain. But Hamilton wrote, we need a one singular executive, a president, because we need one of the three branches to be able to act decisively in times of a crisis or an emergency. And Congress takes forever for a bill to go through the process, but the president, having one executive, can do things much more quickly and decisively. And they will have, because of the checks and balances that we have set up in the Constitution, yes, the president can act decisively, but the president will not become too powerful and overcome the other two branches. And so Hamilton said the checks and balances will keep this one position from becoming too powerful. And that is the end of the first part of Unit 2.